In this ClimateGenn special episode, I'm publishing my first interview with Dr. Jim Hansen, who was at the time Director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. This was recorded in 2012 at the European Geophysical Union, or EGU, the annual conference that takes place every year in Vienna. In recent weeks, I've exchanged emails again with Dr. Hansen to discuss his recent work that has a working title of The Big Climate Short. Hopefully this will be recorded once his latest work is submitted for publication. What strikes me about this decade-old interview is that the language is so clear, and the warnings regarding urgent action are in the time frame of 1 to 1.5 years from 2012. He even states the danger of waiting a decade to what would be 2022. Hansen made the international news in the late 80s when he testified to US Congress about the need to change our energy system and reduce atmospheric greenhouse gases. He is straight, pragmatic, and a clear speaker who has consistently issued warnings that have been ignored despite the rising cost inflicted by such ignorance. Here he gives very clear definitions of what tipping points are, the danger of crossing them, and he discusses the challenges that scientists face in communicating these problems. He also highlights evidence strategies that could have significantly dealt with them at the time, but with each passing year create an ever-growing challenge. We are now where we are. The recent IPCC report talks about the closing window of opportunity to act. Coming at a time of extreme chaos and suffering in Europe, it is hard to see how we will navigate the coming weeks, months, and years. How we deal with our own fear and concern regarding these issues is very important. War is obviously not the answer, and neither is any sense of nihilism. Being able to focus on the problems and act with a broader sense of community is far more rewarding. In the next episode, which I'll publish in the next few days, I am speaking to climate and policy analyst David Spratt, Research Director at the Breakthrough National Centre for Climate Restoration in Melbourne, Australia. We'll be discussing a range of subjects including the accelerating rate of impacts, what climate models don't tell us, as well as the tipping point risks we can't see or measure and that may have already been crossed. Thank you for listening to ClimateGenn. I have many more episodes to produce, so please do subscribe. If you want to support the channel, then you can do that via patreon.com. You can also drop me a note or comment on my website, genn.cc, and I'll always try to respond. Thank you very much.
A climate tipping point refers to the fact that there are physical systems in the climate system that respond only slowly. So we can begin to force them now, but the response will occur over coming decades and centuries, and we may push it beyond a point where that response is going to happen, even if we try to stop it. So for example, an ice sheet. As we change the composition of the atmosphere so there's more energy coming into the planet than there is going out, well, that tends to melt ice. But these ice sheets are 2 or 3 kilometers thick, so they don't respond quickly. But once they do begin to move, they begin to disintegrate, you can get to a point where it's then out of control. It doesn't matter, you can reduce the gases, but the dynamics has taken over. It's going to disintegrate and sea level is going to go up. So you don't want to push the system past those kind of tipping points, because if we do, we leave a situation for our children and grandchildren that will be out of their control. They won't be able to stop it. Well, the Arctic is warming faster than most places on the planet, and that's partly because of the sea ice. Because as we begin to lose some of the sea ice, it exposes the darker ocean, which absorbs more sunlight, and it causes the ocean to warm further and melt more ice. So there is the danger, in fact the likelihood, that we're going to lose all of the Arctic sea ice within the next few decades. There are disagreements as to how long that will take, but it's clear that we're almost certainly going to lose it because the planet is now out of energy balance. There's more energy coming in than going out. And even if we begin to reduce our emissions, there's going to be continued warming in the next few decades. So we will probably lose the summer sea ice. But that's a reversible tipping point, because if the planet cools a few tenths of a degree, then ice will begin to reform in the winter. So that's not like the ice sheets where it'd be an irreversible effect. But there are potential irreversible effects of melting the sea ice. If it begins to allow the Arctic Ocean to warm up and warm the ocean floor, then we'll begin to release methane hydrates. And if we let that happen, that's a potential tipping point that we don't want to pass. Well, there are now observations that methane is beginning to be released by both melting tundra on the land and bubbling up in the Arctic Ocean, indicating some warming of the Arctic Ocean. As yet, the amounts released are not large compared to what humans are releasing in the mining of oil and coal. But there's the danger that we could pass a point where much larger amounts begin to be released. There's enough there to cause as much warming as all the coal in the world. So there's a tremendous amount of methane hydrates frozen on continental shelves. So it's a real danger, one that we don't understand as well as we need to in terms of how rapidly that might happen. We know that it has happened in the Earth's history when the Earth was much warmer, but we don't know if it can happen in the next few decades. That's still a matter of research. However, the recent findings of increased bubbling are certainly a matter of concern. Well, we see this relatively new information on the possibility that methane hydrates are beginning to melt, which is a big danger if it accelerates. It's an example, though, of the kind of thing which, if we continue to tell the public, oh, there's a real big problem, they stop listening. You know, there's this huge gap between what is now understood by the relevant scientists and what is known by the people who need to know, and that's the public. Because to the scientists, we know about these long response times of the system, the fact that it takes time for the ocean to warm up and to have its full effect. It takes time for ice sheets to disintegrate. It takes time for the methane hydrates to really come out in a large amount. And so we see these things beginning to happen and we say, oh my gosh, we've got to tell somebody. But to the public, they don't see that much happening. You know, the weather looks, well, maybe a little different. We're getting storms a little bit stronger and more extreme temperatures, but not very much different. And so it's hard for the scientists to make the public realize that we do have an emergency. If we continue to burn all the fossil fuels, we will certainly get those effects. We can't say exactly what date an ice sheet is going to collapse, but we know that the ice sheets will collapse and sea level will go up many meters. We know that methane hydrates eventually will come out. We can't say when it's going to be really rapid, because these are what we call nonlinear problems, which means, you know, it's like the stock market. If we have bad economic policies, we know eventually it's going to cause the stock market to have a problem and collapse, but we can't predict when that's going to happen. It's a difficult problem, and that's why it's difficult for scientists, because we can see that there's a problem, but how do we get the public to feel it? If we run around with our hair on fire, well, after a while they say, well, there's that guy with his hair on fire again. It's clear that we are certainly not putting the resources into investigating several different problems. The methane hydrates is one of them. Ice sheet stability is another. These things, the economic implications of these potential disasters is so enormous that we should be devoting the resources necessary to understand them, because we don't know how close we are to pushing these systems beyond their tipping points. I think that the concept of adapting to the climate change is really a dangerous one, because there is the potential for climate effects which humanity practically cannot adapt to. If the ice sheets become unstable and sea level goes up multi-meters and eventually tens of meters, well, you're going to put all of the cities on coasts all around the world underwater, and you will destroy all of that heritage. So we don't want that to happen. The economic consequences of that are so enormous. It makes no sense to talk about adaptation to that. And likewise, if we burn all the fossil fuels, then we certainly will cause the methane hydrates eventually to come out and cause several degrees more warming. And it's not clear that civilization could survive that extreme climate change. So talking about adaptation, I think, doesn't make sense, especially when you realize that the actions that are needed for mitigation to prevent the problem actually make sense for other reasons. We would like to move to clean energy future sooner rather than burning up all the fossil fuels. Right now, the only reason we're on that path to burn up all the fossil fuels is that we're subsidizing them. The public is being forced to subsidize fossil fuels because of the power of the fossil fuel industry. Oil, coal industries have so much power in governments all around the world. It's not just the United States. The fossil fuel industry is, in effect, forcing the public to subsidize them. The things that I'm most concerned about climate change are the irreversible effects. Ice sheet disintegration and sea level rise is one example because it takes thousands of years to build an ice sheet. But species extermination is another irreversible potential effect of global warming. We know that a given isotherm, or constant temperature line, is now moving poleward at a rate of about 35 to 40 miles per decade. That means 3 or 4 miles per year. That forces species to migrate to try to stay within the climate zone that they're adapted to. Well, as long as that shift is small, they may not have to migrate, but once it becomes a large shift, it has a big effect on species. And we know this from the Earth's history. There have been times when there was global warming of several degrees, and it drove a large fraction of the species to extinction. And over millions of years, new species evolved. But that's a time scale that humans can't imagine. So if we cause large climate change now with business as usual for another century, we will cause between 20 and 50% of the species to be committed to extinction. That's an immoral thing for us to do when we have the knowledge of what we are doing. So we can't pretend that we don't know that. It's become clear that business as usual for another century will have enormous consequences, including the extermination of many species. Climate change, human-made climate change, is a moral issue because it's an intergenerational injustice. The present generation is getting the benefit of burning fossil fuels, but the consequences will be borne mainly by our children and grandchildren and further generations. That's what needs to be understood, and it is in some ways analogous to the injustice of one human race being subservient to another, slavery of past centuries. And in many ways, it's more serious because the consequences are at least comparable. The consequences will be enormous for generations as far as you can imagine. One of the reasons it was difficult to solve the slavery issue was that it was built into the economic system, and for the same reason, fossil fuels are now built into our system, and there's the resistance of the fossil fuel industry to finding a different path. There are alternative paths, clean energy paths that we could take, but as long as the fossil fuel industry controls the governments, it's very difficult to move down those paths. Economically, the most efficient energy system would be one in which the different energies pay their true costs to society. We should not be subsidizing any energy form. Instead, we should make them pay their true costs. And in the case of fossil fuels, that means the costs of human health damage from the air and water pollution from fossil fuels, but also the impact of climate change on, especially on future generations, although the impacts are already beginning now. But if we would add a fee to fossil fuels, collecting it from fossil fuel companies at the source, at the domestic mine or the port of entry, and distribute that money to the public, 100%, an equal amount to every legal resident of the country, half a share for children, up to 2 per family. That would provide incentive for people to try to minimize their carbon footprint, because if they have less than average fossil fuel use, they will get more in their monthly dividend than they would pay in the increased prices due to the rising fee on fossil fuels. In fact, 60% of the people with the present distribution of energy use would get more in the monthly dividend than they pay in increased prices. And this would provide the incentive for entrepreneurs and business people to develop clean energies. And those people who pay attention to that will begin to make decisions that minimize their carbon footprint, because they would like to stay on the positive side. That's economically the most efficient way to deal with the problem, and in fact it would stimulate the economy. It's exactly what we need now to put more money in the pockets of most people, including the middle income and low income people. If we want to stabilize climate, avoid passing the tipping points of ice sheet disintegration and species extermination, we need to keep global temperature from rising really above the present level. We've already increased the temperature 0.8 of a degree Celsius, which is about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit. It's still not quite as warm as it was in some prior interglacial periods, which were reasonably similar climates. Sea level was about 5 meters higher during the last interglacial. So we don't want to get as warm as or warmer than that. That means that we're going to need to have carbon dioxide on the long run no more than about 350 parts per million. So that means we're going to need to reduce fossil fuel emissions by about 5 or 6% per year if we begin within the next year or two. If we wait 10 years to begin to reduce the emissions, then we'll have to reduce them 15% a year to achieve climate stabilization this century. And that is impractical. That's why it's really important that we begin to have policies that cause a reduction in emissions. And the only way that will happen is if we put an honest price on fossil fuel emissions and give the money that's collected from the fossil fuel companies to the public. I think that the solution to the climate problem probably does require legal action, because the governments are so much under the thumb of the fossil fuel industry that they're not going to willingly make the changes that are needed. But those people who recognize what we are doing to the future of young people are beginning to take legal actions, not only in the United States, but in some other countries. And I think it is important that it be in a number of countries, because once we begin to get action in one major economic bloc, it can become worldwide. If we would have a carbon price in the United States, or say in all of Europe, or China and India, the countries that do understand that they need to make the fossil fuels pay their costs, they begin to put a price on carbon. They can have a border duty on products from other countries that do not have a carbon tax, and that would be a big incentive for these other countries to have their own carbon fee so that they can collect the money rather than have it collected at the borders by the other country.
Thanks again for listening. If you are interested to help support this series and help expand the discussion around climate topics, then please do consider backing my channel via Patreon. It will help me produce more content, and you will also gain access to more expert interviews. It would be great to engage more with audiences too and understand your views on these topics.